Hello there, it's the Poke-Johnny. Today, I am glad to unveil a new show. It's called Pixels and Paintings. This show is about looking at the art in retro video games and telling you what they did well and not so well. This time, we're talking about the Hungry Cheese Circle that has a home in every arcade, Pac-Man. I just want to remind everyone that all the images in this video belong to their respective owners and that I claim none of their images as my own. Anyways, when you think of art in gaming, you don't necessarily think Pac-Man. However, Pac-Man does a few things very right. First of all, the ghosts are all the same no matter where you are in the game. While the ghosts do all behave slightly differently, there is no trouble finding out if this is an enemy or not. For example, in Super Mario Bros., you're pretty much forced to defeat the first Goomba through some really good game design I won't dive into right now. However, when you reach the first overgrown tortoise, you don't know if it's a friend or foe. However, in Pac-Man, since you had to pay for every game in the arcades, Pac-Man does it differently. Even if you knew nothing about Pac-Man, you'd immediately find that the dots are safe. And while you may have assumed it already, you'll soon find that the ghosts are enemies. And since there are no different enemies and all the ghosts look very similar, you don't have to waste too many quarters. Also, you may or may not have noticed that Pac-Man deflates like a balloon when he dies. This also helps show that the ghosts are well and truly bad. Since back in the 80s, pretty much everyone was a video game noob, they may not have understood what was really happening when you hit a ghost. However, since they added the deflation sequence, pretty much anyone could tell that Pac-Man was dying. Once again, these small things make the game so much more accessible and simple, even for noobs, which is definitely a big part of why the yellow mouth got so popular. Another big art decision that really changed the game was making the bonus point things fruits. And pretzels, I guess. Well, they could have made the things look like anything else. They chose food. I think this was because the aforementioned noobs of the 80s didn't really understand point systems. If Pac-Man was just going around absorbing dots, people wouldn't really understand the goal. However, people do understand food, especially in America. This also carries over to the dots, which makes the game seem so much more relatable. Once again, the game continues to be accessible to pretty much anyone. Let's not forget, the cutscenes in Pac-Man were also some of the very first ones. That undoubtedly changed video games, and I think it's for the better. Having a bit more story in video games really makes them more interesting. But that's not the half of it. The final piece of art in Pac-Man that I think changed an industry is the background. While the traditional blue and black backdrop is the most popular, the background would change color every couple rounds. However, since the maze functions stayed the same, it was still accessible. Why is the background so important, you ask? I respond with this. I believe that this changing background helped inspire any and every game with random generation. If you take a look at most games from the time of Pac-Man, you'll find that they are usually level-based, with a palette change every few levels. While that may sound just like Pac-Man, there's a big difference. In Pac-Man, the levels don't change. The enemies get harder, but even they don't change. And the game gets faster, but you're not getting any new elements. And Pac-Man still feels slightly different every time. I may be overstating it a bit, but back in the 80s, people weren't used to huge amounts of the world changing every time you play, like in Minecraft. However, since Pac-Man was an arcade game, you would try to beat your best amount of levels beat. And since your levels beat would affect your color, every time you got a bit further, you got a new experience. And for an arcade game from the 80s, I think that's a good thing. And what exactly makes random generated games better? That there's a new experience every time. I think Pac-Man inspired the idea that you can make new levels without having to make expensive redesigns so the player can have more fun. Now we have all sorts of games with random levels. And that is how Pac-Man inspired random generated games. In conclusion, Pac-Man's simplistic art style helps out the gameplay to make an easily accessible game with a perfect arcade design. This has been the Poke-Johnny on Pixels and Paintings. Bye!